There was something unusual about the Vermont morning. A coldness that pressed not only against Nora Bellamy's window panes, but into the small cracks of her heart. The sky was the color of old pewter, mottled clouds bunching together as if huddling for warmth. Autumn had taken the land in its chilly grip. The red maples and yellow birches that framed Nora's property shivered, dropping leaves that skittered across the damp grass. In the air hung a hush, as if the world was holding its breath. It was on mornings like this that Nora, now 45, felt the weight of her own silence most keenly. Nora had not left her house much these last few years. Since her husband Daniel had passed, her world had shrunk to the size of the faded farmhouse, her manuscripts, and the garden he'd once loved. She was known in town as a novelist, the kind who wrote about wild things and lonely places, but no one in the village of Thistle Run would have guessed how truly isolated she had become. Her nearest neighbor was a mile away. The only thing that greeted her each dawn was the soft whisper of the wind and her own breath, fogging up the kitchen window as she stared out, mug in hand. But this morning, as she made her way to the porch in her thick socks and heavy cardigan, she noticed something that made her freeze: a shape at the gate. At first, Nora thought it might be a deer, but as she squinted, she realized it was much larger and stockier. There, standing perfectly still in the silvery light, was a horse. He was a deep, rich brown, almost black around the mane and tail, with a thick, dust-muddied winter coat. His head was down, and his breath came out in soft, ghostly puffs. Nora's first reaction was confusion, tinged with fear. Horses weren't common this far from the big barns, and certainly not on her property. Who would leave a horse here? Had it escaped from somewhere? Instinctively, she wrapped her cardigan tighter and tiptoed down the steps, heart thudding. The horse didn't bolt. In fact, he didn't move at all. He stood with a patient gravity that seemed almost unnatural, ears forward, eyes deep and unblinking, like he'd been waiting for her. Nora hesitated at the bottom of the steps, her shoes sinking into the soft earth. The ground was muddied from last night's rain, and her gaze fell to a single, perfect hoof print by the gate, a dark oval pressed deep in the mud, water pooling inside it like a mirror. Somehow the sight unsettled her more than the horse itself. There was something almost intentional about that print, as if the animal was leaving her a sign. "Hey there, boy," she called softly, her voice rasping with disuse. The horse lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. There was a calm intelligence in his gaze that sent a shiver up her spine. Nora, who had once loved horses and ridden nearly every day in her youth, felt a strange wave of memory and emotion crash over her. It had been years since she'd been this close to a horse, and something about this one, the set of his ears, the quiet, measured way he breathed, felt eerily familiar. She moved a little closer, boots squelching in the mud, and noticed a scar running down the side of the horse's neck, a pale, jagged line that stood out against the dark hide. Her breath caught. That scar, it reminded her of something, a memory nearly lost in the tangle of years. She'd seen a horse with a scar like that once, long ago, on a farm she and Daniel had visited when they were first married. They'd helped rescue a foal, patching him up after a bad wire fence accident. Later, when money got tight and Daniel lost his job, they'd had to give the horse up. One of those decisions that haunted her ever since. "Is it possible?" she whispered, taking another step forward. The horse, still eerily silent, regarded her with a steady gaze. He didn't whinny, didn't stamp his feet, didn't even toss his head. Instead, he simply closed the distance between them, moving slowly, deliberately, as if not to startle her. Nora's hands shook as she reached out, palm open. The horse lowered his head and nudged her fingers, his muzzle soft and warm, smelling faintly of earth and apples. Nora's fear melted into something else, an awed hush, like standing inside a church. For a long moment, woman and horse stood together in the cold morning, the only sounds the distant caw of a crow and the soft drip of rain from the eaves. Nora felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Something in her stirred, a deep, wordless recognition, a sense that this wasn't just a stray, but a ghost from her past, come back to her in the flesh. As she stroked his neck, her fingers found the scar again, tracing its jagged path. The horse closed his eyes, sighing into her hand, or felt the world tilt, memories spinning out like leaves in a gust. Daniel's laugh, the smell of hay, the bright, wild hope of youth. For the first time in years, she let herself remember, really remember, the life she'd lost, and the love that had once filled this place. Shivering, Nora led the horse through the gate, her mind racing. She knew she'd have to call the local vet, maybe post on the town Facebook group in case someone was missing their animal. But for now, she just wanted to stand with him, to listen to the soft thud of his heart, to believe that miracles, however improbable, could still find their way to her door. As they entered the yard, the horse paused and glanced back at the muddy hoofprint by the gate, as if marking the beginning of something important. Nora, caught between dread and hope, wondered if she'd just opened a door she could never close again. Nora barely slept that night. Every so often, she would roll over in bed, listening for sounds from the barn she hadn't opened in years. The image of the horse haunted her, his calm gaze, the ragged scar, the silent, dignified way he'd allowed her to lead him into shelter. In the pre-dawn dark, with the old house creaking around her, Nora's mind replayed every memory she had of that long-ago summer, when she and Daniel still believed anything was possible. She wondered if Daniel, wherever he was, would approve of what she was feeling now, a mixture of joy, fear, and guilt. When the morning finally came, Nora pulled on her boots and heavy coat and hurried outside. The sky was a lighter gray, the sun only a pale blur behind the clouds. The barn smelled of dust and straw, and as soon as she stepped in, the horse, now temporarily hers, lifted his head. She'd laid out some hay and a bucket of water the night before, but hadn't expected the animal to stay. Yet here he was, as if waiting for her. "Morning, boy," she murmured, voice steadier than it had been in months. He greeted her with a slow blink, as if acknowledging an old friend. Nora dialed the local vet, Dr. Marley, explaining that she'd found a stray horse. Within the hour, a battered pickup rumbled down the gravel drive, and Dr. Marley, a kind woman in her 60s, climbed out, carrying a bag of supplies and her usual air of calm authority. They worked together, examining the horse. Marley found no microchip and checked the teeth. "He's old, Nora," the vet said, running gentle hands over the animal's back. 18, maybe even 20. You can see the years in his teeth and the scars on his body. He's been through a lot, but he's healthy, just thin. If no one claims him, you could give him a good retirement here. Nora hesitated, feeling the responsibility settle onto her shoulders. I'd like that. At least until I find out where he came from." Privately, she was already thinking of him as hers. "I think he deserves a name," Dr. Marley smiled, scratching the horse's withers. "What'll you call him?" Nora studied the deep brown of his coat, the way he carried himself with an almost noble sadness. "August," she said quietly. "After the summer, Daniel and I, well, it just feels right." "August it is," Marley said, making a note on her clipboard. "I'll spread the word. But in a small place like this, it's hard to lose a horse for long. If he belonged to someone nearby, we'd have heard already. After the vet left, Nora busied herself cleaning the barn, tossing out old, moldy bales of hay and setting up a proper stall for August. The activity was comforting, grounding her in the present. But every so often her eyes were drawn to the horse. He watched her as she worked, unafraid, occasionally shifting his weight but never making a sound. There was a peace to him, a sense of patience that unsettled her as much as it soothed. Later that afternoon, as Nora swept out the last of the straw, August began pawing at the dirt near a pile of old boards. At first, Nora thought nothing of it, but when he persisted, snuffling and scraping, curiosity got the better of her. She set her broom aside and knelt beside him, pushing aside the debris. Her hands hit something hard, metal buried in the dirt. Together, woman and horse unearthed a battered horseshoe, heavy and worn, but unmistakable. There, on the inside curve, were 3 faintly scratched initials, DMB. Nora stared at them, feeling her pulse thud in her throat. Daniel Mark Bellamy, her late husband's initials, etched into the iron by his own hand nearly 2 decades ago. She remembered the day he'd done it, laughing in the sun as the young foal, this horse, nuzzled her pockets for apples. For a long moment, the past and present seemed to blur. Nora pressed her palm to her mouth, fighting the sting of tears. August, as if sensing her turmoil, lowered his head and gently nudged her shoulder. The gesture undid her. She broke down, sobbing into his mane, the grief she'd buried for so long rising up like a storm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice muffled and shaking. "I never should have let you go. I never should have let any of it go." For minutes she cried. Cried for the husband she'd lost, for the life she'd let slip away, for every hard decision that had pushed her further from the things she'd loved. August stood quietly, accepting her sorrow as if it were his own. When she finally pulled herself together, Nora wrapped both arms around his neck, breathing in the scent of hay and horse and rain. She felt a new kind of resolve settling in her chest, mingling with the guilt and the grief. If this truly was the horse she'd lost all those years ago, if fate had brought him back to her, she owed him more than food and shelter. She owed him redemption. That night, Nora sat at her kitchen table, staring at the horseshoe as the wind howled outside. The initials caught the light, a simple testament to love, loss, and second chances. She remembered Daniel's words, long ago, when they'd first sent the young horse away. "We're not abandoning him, Nora. We're doing what's best for him. Someday things might work out differently." She'd never believed him, until now. The next morning, Nora stepped into the barn with renewed purpose. August greeted her with that same calm, steady gaze. She stroked his neck, her fingers lingering over the scar that had started this whole mystery. "You're home now," she told him, her voice stronger. "Whatever it takes, I'll make things right." In that quiet, drafty barn, Nora Bellamy made a promise she intended to keep. And as August munched his hay, content for the first time in years, she realized she'd already begun to keep it. That night, Nora's dreams were tangled with the past. She dreamed of Daniel standing in a sunlit field, laughing as a colt galloped around him, dust flying in golden arcs. She woke with tears drying on her cheeks and a strange sense of peace settling over her, as if some small wound she'd carried had started to knit itself together. She decided, after breakfast, that it was time to search through her old things, those boxes she'd sealed and shoved into the attic after Daniel died. She hadn't looked at them in years, but now the urge was irresistible. She rummaged through a pile of sweaters, found the key to the attic, and pulled the creaky ladder down. Dust motes danced in the pale morning light as she climbed, heart pounding with anticipation and a little fear. Inside, the attic was musty and cold. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, some sagging with age, others nearly pristine. Nora pulled a box labeled Farm Days closer, her hands trembling. Inside were photographs, some loose, some in faded albums, and old journals, their covers worn soft by time and handling. She sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through snapshots of her and Daniel, arms wrapped around each other, smiling into the camera with a kind of innocence she hardly recognized. And then she found it. A photo of Daniel, grinning, one arm draped around the neck of a young brown horse. Even as a colt, the horse's eyes had the same quiet intelligence as the animal now living in her barn. There was a patch of white on his forehead and, yes, there it was, a faint line where the scar would later be. Nora's breath caught. She turned the photo over. In Daniel's scrawling script was written, August, summer of 2006. Our wild boy. Her heart thudded as she traced her finger over Daniel's writing. August, she whispered, and a strange warmth filled her chest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile at a memory instead of flinching from it. She paged through the old journal next, her eyes skipping across lists of chores, recipes, Daniel's poems, and in one entry, an account of the day August had cut himself on the fence. He'll heal, Daniel wrote. Just takes patience and time, like everything else worth keeping. Nora felt a presence behind her and almost laughed at herself. But when she finally went back down to the kitchen, she found August standing at the barn door, waiting. He greeted her with a low nicker, nostrils flaring, as if he'd sensed her return to the past. She set the photo on the table and went outside, holding the memory close. August nuzzled her as soon as she entered the barn, pressing his broad head into her chest. The touch was gentle, insistent, a reminder that the past, for all its pain, was also full of moments worth holding on to. Nora wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in the scent of hay, earth, and horse. Her tears surprised her, soft, grateful, not the sharp, painful kind she'd grown used to. Thank you for coming back, she whispered, her voice trembling only a little. August's ears flicked. He leaned into her, warm and solid, a living bridge between who she had been and who she might become. That day, Nora lingered over everything she'd once loved about horses. She cleaned August's hooves, combed his mane, and spoke to him softly, recounting stories she and Daniel had lived. Times when money was tight, but laughter was easy, when even the simplest days felt miraculous. August stood quietly, every so often glancing at her with those deep, understanding eyes. As the sun reached its zenith, casting thin rays through the dusty barn windows, Nora found herself opening up in ways she hadn't dared in years. She spoke to August about her grief, her regrets, the choices that still haunted her. She confessed the guilt that gnawed at her for having let him go, for having let Daniel down, for closing herself off from the world. Some days, it's easier not to remember, she admitted, stroking his back. But then I wonder if forgetting is just another way of losing what little I have left. August responded with a soft whoof, shaking his mane. He rested his head on her shoulder, heavy and comforting. Nora smiled, a true if fragile smile, feeling a little lighter. Later, as she left the barn, she caught sight of herself in the glass of the kitchen door. She was still gaunt, hair streaked with gray, but her eyes seemed less haunted, her shoulders less burdened. For the first time since Daniel died, she saw not a ghost, but a woman starting to reclaim her life. That evening, as twilight painted the sky with bands of purple and gold, Nora sat on her porch and watched August grazing in the fading light. The air was cool, sweet with the scent of distant apple orchards. She thought about the miles August must have traveled, the years he'd spent wandering. She wondered what he'd seen, what losses he'd endured, and marveled that he had found his way back to her. She clutched the old photo to her chest, eyes stinging with gratitude and something that felt almost like hope. Maybe this was what redemption looked like, not erasing the past, but living with it, learning to find joy in the places where grief had taken root. As the stars pricked the velvet sky, Nora whispered a promise to the darkness. She would not let August down again. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as two broken souls, but as survivors, each with scars that marked not just loss, but the possibility of healing. August, sensing the shift, lifted his head and looked toward the porch. Nora raised a hand in silent greeting. Across the quiet Vermont night, it felt like a beginning, one shaped by memory, lit by the hope of second chances. Underscore, 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 underscore. It was Nora who first noticed August's new habit, though it took a few days before she understood it was more than coincidence. Each morning, as she went to the barn with a bucket of oats and a brush, August would be waiting by the gate, his posture alert, almost expectant. After she finished her morning chores, he'd follow her, sometimes at her side, sometimes a step behind, out toward the overgrown orchard that stretched along the eastern edge of her property. At first, Nora wondered if he was simply curious, but it soon became clear that for August, this walk was a ritual. There was something sacred about those walks. The orchard was mostly untended now, trees gnarled and heavy with late autumn leaves, but their sweet scent still lingered in the cold air. Each morning, dew sparkled on the grass, and the world felt fresh, as if everything old and broken had been given a chance to start again. Nora, who for years had walked alone, now had August's steady presence beside her, a companion who neither judged nor questioned, only listened. On one of these mornings, as they made their slow way through the misty grass, Nora was startled to see Mrs. Hensley standing at the property line, holding a basket of apples. Mrs. Hensley, her nearest neighbor and a fixture in the small community, waved cheerfully. She was a sturdy woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Well, look who you've got there," Mrs. Hensley called, eyeing August with clear recognition. "That's the old wanderer, isn't it? He's been turning up in folks' fields for years now, always alone, never causing trouble. He helped my grandson when he got tangled in a barbed wire fence last summer. Stood right over him and kept him calm until we found them." Nora's heart leapt. "You've seen him before?" "Oh, plenty of times," Mrs. Hensley replied, walking closer. "No one could ever get close enough to catch him, though. Looks like you're the first person he's trusted in a long time." Nora looked at August, standing quietly at her side. The horse flicked an ear, as if listening, but otherwise remained still. Mrs. Hensley handed Nora an apple. "He deserves something sweet, after all he's been through." She watched as Nora offered the fruit to August, who accepted it gently, crunching with evident pleasure. Strange thing, though. Sometimes I'd see him standing out by the old pond at dawn, almost like he was looking for someone. Nora felt a pang of guilt and gratitude twist together inside her. She wondered aloud, "Do you think he was looking for me?" Mrs. Hensley patted her arm. "Animals remember, Nora. Horses most of all. My guess is he's been searching for home this whole time." The walks continued, becoming a cherished routine. Nora would talk to August as they strolled, telling him about her sleepless nights and her struggles to find the right words for her novels. She confessed her regrets and her longing for Daniel, sometimes with a wry laugh, sometimes with tears blurring her vision. August would listen, his steady steps beside her acting as both comfort and anchor. One morning, as the first frost dusted the orchard grass, Nora sat on a low stone wall, shivering inside her old wool sweater. August stood close, his breath misting in the cold air. She found herself talking about Daniel, their first years in Vermont, their laughter echoing across the fields, the way Daniel had loved the wild, unpredictable weather. "He used to say the weather here keeps you honest," Nora murmured, half to herself. "You can't control it, can't plan for it. You just take what comes and make the best of it. I think I forgot how to do that after he died." She ran her hand down August's neck, pausing at the familiar scar. "You remember him, don't you? You remember the way things used to be?" August bent his head, resting it gently on her shoulder. Nora closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, warm against the cold. She didn't brush them away. For the first time in a long while, she felt less alone in her grief. Their daily walks drew attention from the rest of the small community, too. Neighbors waved when they saw Nora and August in the orchard. Children riding bikes would stop and watch, whispering stories about the ghost horse who'd finally found a home. Nora received more visitors in those weeks than she had in the last 5 years combined. Some brought apples, others just stories, but all seemed comforted by the sight of Nora walking with the old brown horse. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet, Nora realized that her heart no longer felt as heavy. The ache of Daniel's absence hadn't disappeared, but it was softer now, cushioned by August's steadfast presence. She spoke to him that night, voice barely above a whisper, telling him of her promise. "I won't let you be lost again, not while I have breath left in me." August stood quietly, his eyes reflecting the last gold light of the day. He seemed to understand, and in that moment, Nora knew she wasn't just healing herself. She was helping August heal too. The scars they both carried were proof of survival, not just of pain. As autumn deepened, bringing longer nights and colder winds, Nora and August kept walking the orchard, two souls learning to trust the world again. And in the gentle rhythm of their shared ritual, a broken woman and a scarred old horse began to piece together something that felt very much like hope. Underscore, 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 underscore. The days grew even shorter as November pressed its gray thumbprint across Vermont, and the mornings greeted Nora and August with a sharper chill. Yet, within the warm cocoon of their daily routines, Nora felt something she hadn't in years. A sense of purpose, a quiet anticipation for what each day might bring. The bond between her and August deepened with every passing dawn, his gentle eyes and unspoken loyalty helping her step out of the shadow of grief and into something closer to living. But one overcast afternoon, as Nora cleaned out the barn, a memory pricked at her mind, unsettling, sharp as a splinter. She found herself thinking about the years after she and Daniel gave August up, about the place where they had taken him, the big stable on the edge of town, which had promised to give him a good home. She hadn't visited the place since, and the silence around that decision had always felt heavy. Now, with August back in her life, the silence grew louder, demanding to be broken. Nora stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the low clouds scudding over the fields, and realized she needed answers, not just for her own peace of mind, but for August. She picked up the phone and called Ben, a man she vaguely remembered as one of the younger stable hands from those days. He had always been kind, always sneaking sugar cubes to the horses when the boss wasn't looking. Ben answered on the second ring, his voice older but still tinged with the easy warmth she remembered. "Nora Bellamy? Well, I'll be. It's been years. How are you?" Well, I'm okay," Nora replied, nerves fluttering in her chest. "Ben, I have a question. It's about August, the horse Daniel and I brought to your stable a long time ago. Do you remember him?" A pause. Then, "August, the brown gelding with the scar on his neck? I remember him like it was yesterday." Nora hesitated. "Could we meet? There are things I need to understand." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop in town that afternoon. As Nora parked her car and walked inside, she saw Ben already waiting, his hair gone mostly gray, but his eyes as clear and kind as ever. They exchanged a brief, slightly awkward hug before sitting down with steaming mugs between them. Ben didn't wait for her to start. "I wondered if someone would ever come asking about that stable," he said quietly. "After it shut down, folks tried to forget. But some things shouldn't be buried." Nora's throat tightened. "What happened there, Ben? I thought August would be safe." He looked away, jaw clenched. "At first it was good. But a couple years after you brought August in, the new owner took over. He didn't care about the animals, just the money. Cut corners, overworked the horses, barely fed them. Some of us tried to help, but..." He shrugged helplessly. "We were just kids, you know. Eventually, a few of us quit, but I stayed on as long as I could for the horses." A heavy silence settled. Nora felt a surge of guilt so strong it made her grip the mug tighter. Was he hurt there?" Ben nodded, eyes wet. "He took it hard, Nora. He was loyal. Waited at the gate every day, looking like he was hoping someone would come back for him. He got thin. Some days, the new owner threatened to send him to auction. That's when I started sneaking him out for walks. He trusted me, but he never forgot you and Daniel. You could see it in the way he'd perk up if he heard a car pull up." Nora blinked rapidly, her heart pounding. "How did he get away?" Ben lowered his voice. "It was getting bad. I knew if I didn't do something, he'd be sold off. Maybe worse. So one night, I opened his stall and let him out past the fences. Gave him a head start, then made it look like he'd broken out on his own. The next day, he was gone. I prayed he'd find someone good, or maybe, just maybe, find his way back to you." Nora covered her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. "I never knew. I should have checked. I should have done something." Ben shook his head. "You did what you could. Life's messy. We all have regrets. What matters is what you do with your second chance." They sat in silence, both lost in thought, before Ben spoke again. "You've got him now, right? He found you?" Nora managed a trembling smile. "Yes. He came to my gate one morning. Just stood there, like he was waiting for me." Ben smiled, relief and wonder lighting his features. "That's a good horse. Some animals, you can't keep them from finding home." On her way back, Nora drove past the remains of the old stable. The building was boarded up, windows smashed and weeds curling around the fences. She parked and climbed out, August's old horseshoe tucked in her coat pocket like a talisman. Walking the perimeter, she felt the echo of years gone by, the distant thud of hooves, Daniel's voice, the laughter and trust that once filled this place. Now all that remained was silence. Inside, through a crack in the boards, She saw dusty stalls and an overturned water bucket, sunlight slanting across the straw-strewn floor. For a moment, she pictured August there, alone, hungry, hoping for rescue. The weight of her absence crushed her, but mingled with it was gratitude for Ben's courage and August's loyalty. She pressed her hand against the splintered wood, a silent apology, a promise. "I'm sorry, old friend. I'm here now. I won't let you go again." That night, Nora sat in the barn with August, running her fingers through his mane as he munched quietly on fresh hay. She whispered stories of Daniel, of second chances, of good people like Ben who stepped up when it mattered most. August listened, soft-eyed and calm, his presence a living testament to the power of hope and the redemptive force of returning home. In the warm glow of the barn, with wind rattling the windows and the past finally brought into the light, Nora understood. She could not change what happened, but she could make amends. She could love August for all the years they'd lost, and all the ones they still had left. It was as if digging into the past had stirred up not only old wounds, but also an undeniable longing in Nora. Now that the truth about the stable was out and she'd faced her guilt head-on, another need grew inside her, a need to understand what August had truly endured in the long, lonely years between his leaving and his return. She wanted to know, not just guess, where he had gone, how he had survived, and what traces of their old life he had managed to hold on to. It was about more than curiosity. It was about honoring everything he'd been through, and honoring Daniel's memory, too. So one pale Saturday morning, as brittle leaves scuttled across the barnyard, Nora called Ben. "Would you help me retrace August's steps?" she asked, almost sheepishly. Maybe we can find pieces of where he's been." Ben didn't hesitate. "Of course. I'd like that, Nora. He deserves for us to know." He arrived that afternoon, parking his battered old truck beside Nora's farmhouse. He'd brought a dog-eared notebook, a handful of crumbling maps, and a thermos of strong black coffee. The air was brisk, hinting at the first taste of winter. They started at the edge of Nora's property, following the direction August had likely taken after Ben helped him escape so many years ago. Ben pointed out the gap in the fence he'd loosened, and they followed the faintest trace of a trail, now half choked with brambles, toward the line of woods that bordered the back fields. August followed behind them, nostrils flaring, as if he knew he was leading them through his old secrets. At times he would pause and sniff the air, or stop by a particular tree or clump of brush, nudging at something hidden under leaves. As they pressed deeper into the woods, Ben spotted something glinting near the base of an old oak. Kneeling, he brushed away the dirt to reveal a faded, moth-eaten horse blanket, the initials NB faint but still visible on a corner. Nora Bellamy. She gasped softly, tracing her fingers over the monogram. "This was Daniel's," she whispered. "He used it in the winter. Said it kept the horses warmer than anything you could buy." She lifted the blanket to her face, breathing in the ghost of an old scent. Hay, sweat, sunlight. August stepped close, nuzzling the fabric, his eyes growing soft and distant. The blanket had been his shelter, Nora realized, a tangible thread to a past life when the world had made more sense. They continued on, and the forest thinned out into a wide, rocky creek bed. There, beneath a half-collapsed footbridge, Nora found a battered feed bag, so sun-bleached the logo was barely legible, but she recognized the worn strap, patched with Daniel's crude sewing, the thread still stubbornly blue. She held it up for Ben to see. "He carried this all these years," she said, a lump in her throat. Together they sat on the stones beside the creek, the cold water rushing by, holding the blanket and feed bag like relics. Ben put a comforting hand on Nora's shoulder. "He never really left you, Nora," he said quietly. "Even after everything, he carried pieces of your life with him." August wandered to the water's edge and drank deeply, then returned to stand between them, lowering his head so Nora could rest her hand on his brow. She closed her eyes, letting her memories swirl. Christmases spent in the barn, Daniel's easy laugh, the feeling of a simpler happiness she once thought was gone forever. As the sun began to sink, casting orange streaks across the sky, they retraced their steps, finding bits of August's journey, a patch of fence where his mane had snagged, a ring of flattened grass where he might have slept. Each small discovery was both a balm and a fresh ache. Nora felt sorrow for all the years they'd lost, but also gratitude for this strange, miraculous reunion. It felt, for once, like the universe was giving her a chance to make things right. When they arrived back at the farmhouse, Nora tucked the old blanket over August's back. The horse stood quietly, as if he understood the importance of the moment, and let Nora press her cheek to his neck, silent tears slipping down her face. That evening, she and Ben shared a simple meal in the kitchen, laughter mixing with quiet reflection. Ben recounted stories of other animals he'd rescued, and Nora listened, her heart lighter with every tale. She realized with a sudden clarity that the grief she'd carried for so long was finally shifting, making room for gratitude and even, timidly, for hope. After Ben left, Nora returned to the barn. August was already settled, his breathing deep and steady. She leaned against the stall door, watching him in the half-light. The barn, which had once seemed haunted by loss, now felt like a place of sanctuary, of second chances. Nora took the blanket and the feed bag inside, placing them carefully on her dining room table beside the old photo and the horseshoe. Each object told a story, a testament to survival, endurance, and the enduring bonds of love. As she turned out the light, she whispered a prayer of thanks for August's courage, for Ben's kindness, for the grace that sometimes finds its way through even the darkest places. That night, she dreamed not of loss, but of running. Her and Daniel, young and wild, August a foal galloping behind them, the sun on their backs and laughter in the air. And when she woke, Nora understood. Some memories are not meant to be buried. They are meant to be honored, cherished, and above all, shared. The trail of hooves was not only a map of August's journey home, it was a map of Nora's journey back to herself. The November wind howled through the trees, shaking the windows of the farmhouse and driving flurries of brown leaves across the yard. Nora awoke well before dawn, startled by a sense of emptiness so sharp it made her heart race. At first, she thought it was a bad dream, but when she stepped out onto the porch, she felt it in her bones. The barn was too quiet. She hurried across the frosted grass, her breath puffing in the cold, the lantern in her hand bobbing wildly. The barn door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, August's stall stood open and empty. Nora's chest clenched. For a wild moment, she thought of all the years she'd spent not knowing where he was, how easily she could lose him again. "August!" she called, her voice cracking the silence, echoing through the orchard and the shadowed hills beyond. Nothing answered but the wind. She ran back into the house, grabbed her coat and boots, and called Ben in a panic. "He's gone," she choked out. "August is gone. I don't know where." Ben was calm, his voice steady. "He can't have gone far. Think, Nora, where would he go? Where's the place that means the most to him?" Nora's mind spun. The orchard. The barn. And then it struck her. The spot on the ridge where she and Daniel had scattered his ashes, under the old white pine, overlooking the meadow where wildflowers bloomed every spring. It was a place she had avoided for months after Daniel died, the ache of loss too much to bear. But she remembered, too, how August used to stand by Daniel's side in that meadow, content just to be near him. Nora ran, stumbling through the tangled grass, up the slope toward the pine. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the horizon smeared with lavender and gold. Her breath burned in her chest. As she crested the rise, she saw him, August, standing perfectly still in the dawn mist, his great head bowed. He was facing the small, rough stone that marked Daniel's resting place. For a moment, Nora just stood and watched, her heart breaking with a kind of awe. August did not move, but his entire body radiated a quiet grief, a deep, patient mourning that seemed to connect him to Daniel, to Nora, and to the long years of loss they'd both survived. Nora moved forward quietly, afraid to break the spell. She knelt beside August, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. The horse turned and pressed his nose against her chest, and Nora lost herself in the softness of his breath, the warmth of his presence. Together they faced the stone, and Nora felt every memory, sweet and bitter, rise inside her. "I miss him too," she whispered, voice ragged. "Every single day. I'm sorry I left you, August. I'm sorry for everything." A long silence followed, broken only by the rustle of wind through pine needles. Nora let her tears fall freely, grieving not just for Daniel, but for the years she'd spent trying not to feel. August stood beside her, unmoving, as the sky turned pink with the promise of a new day. She remembered the day Daniel had died, how quickly and unfairly illness had stolen him away. The world had become unbearably empty. She'd shut herself off, convinced that if she just didn't remember, she couldn't hurt. But August's return had broken that dam, forcing her to confront the ache and, strangely, to feel something like hope again. After what felt like an eternity, August moved closer to the stone, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed the earth. Nora watched, astonished, as the horse stood there in a pose of almost reverent silence, as if saying goodbye in his own way. It was then she realized August hadn't just been lost. He'd been mourning too. He had come here not to leave, but to honor the one person who'd loved him first. Nora traced her fingers over the stone, feeling the rough etchings of Daniel's name. "He would be so proud of you, August. Of both of us, maybe, for not giving up." As the sun crested the hills, the first golden light bathed them in warmth. Nora stood, brushing the dew from her jeans. She pressed a kiss to August's scar, a symbol of all the pain and resilience that bound them together. They walked back home slowly, the world hushed around them. Nora felt something lift inside her, a weight that had pressed her down for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without pain. For the first time, her memories of Daniel shimmered with gratitude instead of regret. When they reached the barn, Ben was waiting, worry etched in his face. Relief swept over him as he saw them safe. "I knew he'd be with you," he said, voice thick. He needed to say goodbye too. That evening, Nora sat in the barn with August and Ben, the three of them sharing the warmth of hay and old memories. Nora talked for the first time about the guilt she'd carried, the fear that she'd failed both Daniel and August. Ben listened without judgment, and August, as always, stood quietly by her side, the steady presence she needed. As the night deepened and the stars bloomed above the fields, Nora whispered, "I forgive you, August, and I forgive myself." It felt like a small miracle, the first real step toward healing. She hung Daniel's old horseshoe by the barn door that night, letting it catch the moonlight. A silent promise that this place and these memories would always be safe. The next morning when Nora woke, the ache was still there, but softer, transformed by forgiveness and the gentle knowledge that love, even lost, was never truly gone. August stood waiting by the gate, as he always did, but now his eyes held a lightness, a peace that matched her own. Together they stepped out into the dawn, no longer just survivors of sorrow, but companions on a new journey, one shaped by remembrance, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to begin again. It was only after that morning by Daniel's grave that Nora truly noticed how much she and August had changed. The ache of loss was still there, but the emptiness was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose that gathered strength with every sunrise. August had not just come home to her. He'd brought her back to herself, back to her community, and slowly back to the world she'd turned away from for so long. Word of August's return and their story traveled through the small town of Thistle Run faster than any rumor ever had. It started with the neighbors, Mrs. Hensley, who'd watched August's lonely wandering for years, brought over jars of apple preserves and stories of how the old horse had stood watch over her grandson. The mailman left extra carrots in Nora's mailbox. Children began appearing at the orchard's edge, pressing their faces to the fence, hoping for a glimpse of the legendary brown horse who'd found his way home. At first, Nora was shy, even suspicious of the growing attention. But as she saw the light in people's faces, the way August's calm presence eased their worries, the way even strangers seemed to leave with softened voices and brighter eyes, her heart opened. She realized that August's story was not just hers to keep. It was a gift, a thread of healing that could stitch together all the quiet hurts hiding behind the smiles of her neighbors. One afternoon, as the golden light of late autumn pooled in the orchard, Nora watched as a young girl named Harper, her red hair a wild flame in the wind, tiptoed up to the gate. Harper's mother trailed behind, looking tired and uncertain, her hand clutching a hospital bill. Nora smiled gently. "You can pet him if you like," she called. August, ever patient, stood perfectly still as Harper reached through the fence, her small fingers trembling. When her hand touched his muzzle, the girl's whole face lit up. Nora watched as the tension melted from Harper's mother's shoulders. He's beautiful," the woman whispered. "Thank you for sharing him with us." It was then that the idea began to bloom in Nora's mind. August had brought healing to her family, and now, if she was brave enough, maybe to the wider world. She thought of all the horses she'd read about, rescued from neglect or wandering alone, and the people whose lives might change if they had a place to meet them. The old orchard, with its peaceful trees and long memories, could become something more. That night, Nora sat at her desk, dusting off the old notebook where she'd once kept story ideas. Instead, she started a list. August's Meadow, a place for healing, for horses, and for people. She wrote it out, then wrote it again, this time with hope and trembling excitement. She called Ben, telling him her plan in halting, nervous sentences. To her relief, he didn't laugh. "It's perfect," he said. "You always did have a way of turning pain into something beautiful." Word spread, and soon people from town began to offer help. Mrs. Hensley donated tools, a local carpenter repaired the broken fences and built a new shelter. The old orchard, once a neglected patch of tangled trees, transformed. They planted wildflowers and put up a sign at the gate, "August's Meadow, sanctuary for horses and hearts. August himself became the ambassador. He'd stand quietly with children who were scared to talk, nuzzle widowers who'd lost their partners, and allow tired nurses to rest their heads against his neck in the evenings. Each visitor brought their burdens, and each left a little lighter. Stories began to circulate. The woman who found the courage to visit her son's grave after meeting August. The teenage boy who stopped fighting at school after volunteering at the meadow. The elderly veteran who taught August to bow in greeting. As August's meadow grew, Nora found her own spirit rekindled. She started writing again, not just stories, but essays about grief and redemption, articles about animal rescue, letters to old friends. For the first time in years, she no longer dreaded the ringing phone or the knock on her door. She welcomed people, volunteers, neighbors, strangers drawn by the story of a horse who found his way home. But not every day was easy. There were setbacks. A storm tore down part of the new shelter. A rescued mare arrived so skittish she would barely eat. There were days when Nora still woke with tears on her pillow, the old ache sharp in her chest. But those days no longer felt hopeless. Surrounded by the meadow, by August, by the lives she touched and was touched by in turn, she felt Daniel's spirit in the wind and sun, whispering, "You're doing good, Nora. Keep going." Sometimes at dusk, Nora would sit in the orchard, her back against a gnarled apple tree, August grazing nearby. She'd watch the shadows grow long and listen to the hum of laughter and voices from the meadow. She thought about how August had never given up, how, in his own silent, stubborn way, he had stitched together a community from the pieces of his old life. One evening, Mrs. Hensley stopped by with a plate of fresh cookies and a shy smile. "You know, Nora, people say August has a gift. Some call it a miracle, but I think it's just love. Simple, steady, and stubborn. That horse remembers everyone who's ever been kind to him, and he gives it back, tenfold." Nora nodded, her heart full. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, in the end. Under the autumn stars, with August by her side, and her neighbors' laughter floating across the fields, Nora knew they had built something that would outlast grief. The scars, hers, August's, even the orchard's twisted branches, were not marks of brokenness, but of survival, of beauty born from endurance. August's meadow had become more than a rescue. It was a testament that love, even battered by loss and time, could grow again if given a little space, a little care, and the courage to begin anew. The opening of August's meadow was a quiet but profound affair, the kind that seemed to resonate through the town in waves of gentle change. The air was crisp, leaves dancing on a lazy autumn wind, as neighbors and strangers gathered at the orchard's edge. A handmade banner fluttered over the gate. Grand opening, August's meadow. Tables were set with apple cider and homemade pies. Children ran laughing between the trees, their parents lingering on the fences, exchanging stories that always seemed to circle back to hope and second chances. Nora stood by the entrance, her hands trembling, not with fear, but with the enormity of what this moment meant. Ben was by her side, dressed in his best flannel, and August, the true guest of honor, grazed serenely nearby, his coat glossy under the pale sunlight. As the crowd quieted, Nora stepped forward to speak, her voice hesitant at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I want to thank you all for coming," she began, her eyes sweeping the faces of her community. "August's Meadow isn't just a place for horses who've lost their way. It's a place for all of us, for anyone who's carried something heavy, who's wondered if healing is possible, who's needed a reminder that kindness and hope can find you, even after you've given up on yourself." She paused, feeling the emotions swell in her chest. August lifted his head, as if listening, his ears flicking forward with gentle curiosity. Nora's gaze lingered on him, and she let herself remember all the things she'd been afraid to say. "I lost my husband a few years ago," she continued quietly. "I lost myself, too. I shut the world out, thinking if I could just forget, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. But grief doesn't disappear when you lock it away. It just waits, patient as a good horse, until you're ready to face it." When August came home, I realized that love and memory can carry us further than we think. Sometimes the heart remembers who loved it right, even after years of wandering. A hush settled over the crowd. Nora's voice grew steadier. "Horses, animals, hold more than we know. They carry our laughter, our pain, our secrets. They remember gentle hands, harsh words, small kindnesses." August came back to me not just as a survivor, but as a witness to everything we lost, but also everything we can find again, if we're brave enough. She looked down at August, who stepped closer, nudging her hand. "I owe him a debt I can never repay, but I hope this meadow, and all who find their way here, can honor the message he brought, that redemption isn't about undoing the past, but about how we respond when we're given a second chance." As she finished, the crowd was silent for a moment. Then, softly, applause rose, warm and genuine. People wiped at their eyes, hugged one another, whispered words of comfort and courage. After the speech, guests explored the meadow, meeting the first rescues that had already joined August. An old Appaloosa with a bent leg, a tiny black mare who'd been afraid of every sound until she met August and Nora. Children ran alongside the horses, laughter echoing through the orchard. Volunteers led tours of the barn, pointing out the blankets and feed bags, remnants of journeys, testaments to survival. Ben found Nora by the paddock fence. He squeezed her shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "You did good, Nora. Daniel would be proud. We're all proud." Nora smiled, blinking back tears. "I think, for the first time, I'm proud of myself too." Throughout the day, people shared their own stories of loss, regret, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, healing could happen for them as well. Mrs. Hensley told the tale of how August had comforted her grandson, and a local teacher admitted she'd started bringing troubled students to the meadow for quiet time. Even the mayor confessed he'd never understood grief until he lost his brother, and now found peace just standing by the fence, watching the horses graze. As dusk gathered, the meadow glowed golden under lanterns strung from tree to tree. Nora took a quiet walk around the grounds, pausing to touch each horse, to listen to the laughter and low conversation. Everywhere, she felt the pulse of life, the quiet miracle of a community piecing itself together, scar by scar, heart by heart. At the end of the evening, as the last guests filtered out, Nora stood by the gate with August. She looked up at the stars pricking the deep blue sky and found herself speaking softly, not just to August, but to Daniel, and to the lost parts of herself she'd finally begun to reclaim. "You were right, Daniel. Healing isn't forgetting. It's remembering the right things and giving them a place to grow." August nudged her gently, as if to say he understood. In that moment, Nora knew. Her pain hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It had become something she could carry, something she could use to help others carry their own. The meadow would stand as proof, a living promise that scars are not shameful, but sacred. That what horses hold, what any heart holds, is not just sorrow, but the astonishing capacity to heal, to hope, and to love again. As the gate swung closed behind her, Nora felt the cool night settle in. But she was not alone. In every rustle of leaves, every soft snort from the barn, every story whispered over the fence, she felt the presence of all those, human and animal, who had ever believed that broken things can be made whole again. Winter's first snow drifted down on Thistle Run with a gentle hush, blanketing August's meadow in shimmering white. The branches of the old apple orchard bent under the soft weight, and the world seemed to hold its breath, wrapped in a cocoon of peace and new beginnings. The barn was warm and full of life, children's laughter, the low hum of volunteers chatting as they filled water troughs, and the comforting thud of hooves on fresh straw. It had been months since Nora first opened the gates of August's meadow. In that time, the place had become a sanctuary, not only for horses but for people who carried invisible burdens. Nora herself had changed, her face no longer drawn and shadowed, but open, lined with the kind of joy that comes only after long sorrow. She had grown into her new role as caretaker, teacher, friend, and neighbor. Where once she had hidden from the world, she now welcomed it in, morning after morning. On a day when the snow fell in slow, steady curtains, a pickup pulled up to the gate. From it stepped a local farmer, his hands cradling something small and trembling. A colt, barely a few weeks old, shivering and wild-eyed. The colt's mother had died during a blizzard. The farmer, hearing of August's meadow, hoped this might be a place for the frightened foal to find a second chance. Nora moved quietly, heart beating fast as she saw the colt, a dark, gangly thing with a white star on its brow. She remembered August as a young horse, how Daniel had calmed him with gentle words and steady hands. August, now older and slower, watched from his paddock as Nora welcomed the colt into the warmth of the barn. That night, she stayed up late, feeding the colt milk from a bottle, singing old lullabies into the hush of falling snow. The next morning, the whole meadow seemed to pause as the colt took his first tentative steps outside. Nora stood beside August, her hand resting on his strong, scarred neck. The foal blinked at the brightness of the world, then broke into a clumsy, joyful gallop, circling the yard, kicking up powdery snow. August, as if remembering himself as a colt, tossed his head and let out a low, rumbling nicker of encouragement. All around, volunteers and children cheered, and Nora felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. She realized in that instant that August's meadow was more than a rescue or a memorial. It was a living symbol. The foal's wild run traced the same path August had walked in his youth, a circle of return and renewal. In that young life was the promise that even after the hardest winters, something new could begin. When the crowd drifted away, Nora lingered at the gate. She reached up and touched the old, battered horseshoe now hanging there. Daniel's horseshoe, the same one August had unearthed. It had become an emblem, weathered but strong, catching the light with each new sunrise. To Nora, it was a promise that love would always find its way home. August stepped beside her, his breath warm in the winter air. Nora leaned against him, closing her eyes as memories flooded in. Of Daniel's laughter, the long years of loss, and the quiet strength of forgiveness. She thought about how she'd once believed she would always be alone, and how wrong she'd been. In letting herself love again, in loving August, the meadow, her neighbors, she had discovered a new kind of family. That afternoon, as snow continued to fall, Nora invited the children and volunteers into the barn for hot chocolate and stories. She read aloud from her new book, her first since Daniel's passing, dedicated to August and to all the creatures, great and small, who'd taught her about hope. As she spoke, she watched faces light up with wonder and relief, and she knew, deep down, that telling her story was a gift. not just for herself, but for everyone gathered in that warm circle of light. Before bed, Nora took one last walk beneath the stars. The meadow glittered in moonlight, the orchard casting long shadows on the snow. She paused at Daniel's grave, which she'd decorated with holly and a ribbon, and whispered, "Thank you for loving me, for teaching me to keep going, for sending August home." In that hush, she felt a presence. Not just Daniel, but every soul she'd loved and lost, every animal who had passed through her gates. She understood, in a way she never had before, that grief and joy would always walk together. Some souls, she thought, only walk with us briefly. Some return when we least expect it, and show us that love never really leaves. It simply changes shape, growing deeper and wider with each goodbye and each new hello. As she turned to leave, the young colt galloped across the snowy paddock, his dark shape flashing through the moonlight. August watched him, head held high, and for a moment, Nora could almost see Daniel beside her, his arm around her shoulder, both of them laughing in the cold. At the gate, Nora paused and looked back at the barn, at the horses, the people, the glowing lights that spilled out into the night. She smiled, knowing that solitude had become service, and her sorrow, once so heavy, had become the wellspring of something beautiful and enduring. She whispered a final message, her breath turning to frost in the air. "If there's a shadow at your gate, don't be afraid to open it. It may carry the light you've forgotten you needed." And as Nora closed the gate behind her, she knew that August's meadow and the love that built it would carry on long after her own footsteps had faded, echoing through every heart willing to believe that broken things can be made whole again.